I just want to say, ladies, thank you so much for coming on, joining this conversation, and helping to further the conversation around safe sport in Canada. It is a very important topic. We all have our stories and experiences. They're all very unique to us. Unfortunately, though, there is a common theme around safe sport in Canada. And, level, age, gender, sport does not discriminate against this topic. And so the more that we can acknowledge it, the more we can share our individual stories and help elevate the conversation, but give it the right and proper direction to move forward. I think that's extremely important. So I would love to hear a little bit for people that don't know, each of you women, a little bit about your stories, and then we'll move forward from there. Allison, do you want to start?
Sure. Thanks, Kaillie. It's great to see you. This is fun. I mean, it's so nice to be able to connect with people that I know from different walks of life and sport mainly, and have this opportunity. My name is Allison Forsyth. I'm a two-time Olympian in the sport of alpine skiing. My safe sport journey, it started in the late 90s. I was a victim of sexual abuse within the Canadian sports system. And it really started truthfully in 2015 when the perpetrator of our abuse was arrested. So very specifically, the abuse that many of us young athletes suffered at the hands of one very egregious predator. It was covered up specifically by the National Sporting Organization to the extent where he was allowed to resign and no investigation happened. And we're talking about serious, egregious sexual abuse. So finally, he was arrested in 2015. So a group, myself and 12 other survivors of abuse, ended in a 2.5-year criminal trial and investigation, which was obviously arduous, but worth it. And he received 12 years in prison. At that point, I think about a year after that, we'll all sort of remember that, the Larry Nassar case, that trial was also happening. And the US was starting to make some changes. Most notably, the US Center for Safe Sport was struck. A lot of advocacy groups and survivor groups were built into the system in the US, and Canada wasn't doing anything. So a group of us survivors of that abuse came forward, had our publicity ban lifted so we could use our names, and then just started to lobby the federal government, as well as did some media around making some critical changes to the sport system. The last thing I'll mention is I love sport. I think a sport is a wonderful place to raise your children, of which I'm raising 3. So I don't want this conversation to be completely negative, but we need to be smarter about how sport is dealt with, and obviously a more holistic approach. And I'm very honest and transparent. I'm really sad right now. I sit here very sad in that I really feel, Kaillie and everyone else here, that the complexities of safe sport and the challenges that actually happen to us in that high performance environment, in my opinion, don't seem to be really be taking into account yet. It seems to be very still black and white policies, codes of conduct, which of course we all know will help. But I think 3 of us can really attest to the unbelievable complexity that safe sport brings to high performance athletes within their environment. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. And just how behind I find, and I'm sure
Right.
I know all of us can speak to, those policies and procedures are. They are super outdated. They are behind. They need to be updated to move forward in order to keep protecting athletes. And yeah, it's a mile long of where it needs to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. Charity?
Yeah, hi. Again, so excited to be on this call with the 3 of you. It's nice to meet 2 of you. I've never met Rosie or Allison, so nice to meet you. Nice to see you again, Kaillie. My name is Trady Williams. I'm a 2-time Olympian. I play for Rugby Canada. I guess my safe sport journey started when I was 16, my first year on the team, and I've been here ever since, and it's been a roller coaster. But I think when we really dove into it as a team was just before Tokyo, and we spent a year fighting and battling our head coach, our federation, only to go through an investigation to be told that our stories and our experiences were not valid and didn't fit into our policy of abuse and harassment and bullying. And so it was a very difficult time for us, especially leading into such a huge competition. As you all know, how important the Olympics is, and how much time and energy and just your soul that you put into training. So it was tough, and it was tough to not be validated by the people who were supposed to keep us safe and the policies who are supposed to look after us and our safety and our well-being in that program. So yeah, I think this conversation is so important. And I kind of what you, Allison, were talking about policies, they're very, very outdated. I think ours hadn't been touched or reassessed or even looked at since the beginning of Rugby Canada. And since our investigation and since the ruling that our stories and experiences weren't valid, they have changed and updated those policies. And it's just one of those things where it's a little too late. And it's not really coming to it's not looking at us and our experiences, and thankfully the policies are being updated and they're being changed, and we have all these groups and these groups to support and change that policy for the future generation. But the people who are here, the people who've been here, the people who have had to cut their careers short because of different experiences that they have, the people who I know, some athletes who probably could have been amazing Olympic athletes who never got the opportunity and never got the shot. Those people aren't being looked after, and that to me is one of the most disappointing things. So yeah, I'm really grateful to be here with the three of you, and I think this conversation is just so important. So thank you for joining me here.
Of course. Thank you for joining us. I think we can, again, all agree policies and procedures not only outdated, but what we've seen, what we're currently experiencing, and then how long it takes to change that moving forward. And yeah, the amount of people, men, women, that are affected by these policies. And personally, I'm currently still going through an investigation 5 years later, and I'm finding that the policies and procedures are not there to necessarily protect the athletes, but to cover up or to help protect abusive coaches, toxic cultures and environments. They're not meant necessarily, although they're supposed to be for safety. I personally feel like they're meant there to help cover up or to give power to our leadership. And so I think that the more we can empower ourselves with knowledge, and then the more we can talk about it, and especially from sport to sport, the more we can help protect all of Canadian athletes as a whole, and that it's not so segregated or separate from here's rugby, here's skiing, here's bobsled, here's gymnastics. We can all start to go, wait a second, if that's there, we have these, how is that not all the same? And how do we not all have a big umbrella of safe sport, and why is it all, different? And so with that, Rosie.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very humbled to be part of this conversation. My sport is rhythmic gymnastics. I started when I was 5, ended up retiring after the London 2012 Olympic Games when I was 21. And at first, my role in sport advocacy was more in LGBTQ sport inclusion. So I did that for several years, and obviously directly tied to SafeSport as well. Just started merging into kind of different levels of SafeSport. And, at the same time, recently there's been some investigations going on into gymnastics in Canada as well, with regards to, how to implement a safer space for athletes across the country. And, something I want to talk about today, which I think people need to kind of pay attention to, is the fact that gymnastics and other sports that are performance sports are sports for children, right? Like I said, we start when we're 5, and personally, I was at a high performance level when I was 8, right? So that's something very important to take in and to add to the conversation, that these are children facing the abuse, and that also means that these are children trying to navigate, what it means to understand even what's safe and not safe. And then also, of course, how do you expect a child to, 1, understand safety in sport, and then 2, how to consider reporting that as well. So there's a lot of onus on the adults in sports like gymnastics. And unfortunately, the adults in the sport as I found and many other gymnasts have found, have not been responsible in keeping athletes safe. So that's something that, needs to be needs to be changed.
Experiencing it myself at 30, 31, 32, I could only imagine being 12, 13, 14 years old, not having that life experience to draw from, not understanding how to navigate, let alone I felt like I was let down by the leadership. And yet, what are you supposed to do at 10, 11, 12, 13 years old when you're told to entrust in those people, in the coaches, in the high performance directors, in the head coaches, in the leadership? And at the end of the day, we're all human beings, and there is abuse of power, there is abuse of process, whether it be, discrimination, assault, sexual, mental abuse that occurs within sport. And there needs to be, and I think a big issue personally is the accountability piece. As athletes, we are all held accountable through performance. You don't perform, you don't make the team. But at the end of the day, there is very little accountability for some coaches in some sports. And whether it be that they're able to continue coaching and go on to an Olympics while you're on the sidelines during an investigation, or you got punished because your carding got taken away, or you go through these different situations. There isn't like a database either, whether it be, a coach or an administrator, where these sports and everyone is held accountable to the same levels. And that's personally something that I think needs to happen moving forward, so that we can all be held accountable to our performance in the role that we play in sport. And through that, it's why we have policemen. It's why we have other systems in place, checks and balances that occur, so that we can not only protect what we have, but then also protect future from the one or two bad apples that do exist. Because as Allison, you said, it's not everybody. I'm sure we all have stories of some amazing coaches throughout our careers that have shaped our lives, that have shaped our sport. And unfortunately, that gets overshadowed by a conversation like this, with the one bad apple that really has come in and does affect and change hundreds of lives. And unfortunately, one bad person can wreck a lifetime of experiences and can derail a career. When I came to Team USA, the very first thing that everybody has to do, there's background checks for all coaches and all athletes being involved in national team sport. You have to do every single year a 1 hour presentation on SafeSport. You learn what abuse, harassment, discrimination is, how to report, who to report it to. You learn about your policies and procedures. I don't know about you women, but when I went through sport and right before I made my claim, I had no idea what I was doing, where to go, who to talk to, how to even use the magic words to report. And when I did and felt I was consistently telling the leadership, hey, I don't feel safe around this coach. Here's what's happening. I'm extremely depressed. Here's what's going on. I'm publicly humiliated and demeaned. I don't want to be here anymore. What am I supposed to do? It was, well, suck it up. He's not going anywhere. Well, too bad for you. And if you do, well, you're going to lose your funding and you won't be on the team. So probably just ignore it. And so in understanding those things, there is a lot of steps that have to go. But what I would like to know is, how did this affect you guys in your everyday lives too? Sport is only one part, but how did your experiences really shape who you are outside of that, with like family and friends and, in the workspace?
I can share. One thing I want to mention before I share, as you were speaking, Kaillie, we talk about toxic cultures, and I just think it's really important to know that like a massive paradigm shift has to happen. And I think a lot of times I think a lot of people could be even watching this and listening to this and being confused as to why athletes are so vulnerable to abuse, because for me, it was to acknowledge my vulnerability when I felt like I was such a strong, hardcore Olympian, that we actually are incredibly vulnerable in targets because of how bad we want to win. And I'll just share from my perspective that like what I suffered was horrific. And when I was shamed and guilted and coerced into not exposing it, I had to live with the complicity of abuse. I don't know if you guys have had that experience. I'm sure you have, but the complicity of feeling like I was responsible for what happened because nobody cared. And nobody, Kaillie, I think what you just said really resonated with me. Like no one seemed to think what happened was a big deal. And what happened to me and what happened to you and Rosie, that's a big deal, right? And so what I had to live with for still to this day is people will come up to me and say, but Allison, you were successful. Like as if being sexually abused was okay because I got to the Olympics and was one of the best athletes in the world. So the dichotomy that exists between what we, even as parents, I see these hockey parents, right? Like even as parents, what they think they really want for their children and what happiness and health looks like is making the NHL. Like we need to give our head a shake. Redefining success is critical. For me, it's affected every aspect of my life. I'm always very open about, because I believe strongly in mental health challenges. I'm very open about the mental health challenges I've had, the substance abuse challenges I've had. I went into a rabbit hole of coping mechanisms, PTSD coping mechanisms, as I'm sure we all have. And we were literally sent on the road a week later as if nothing had happened. So the level of trauma and victimization, I'm sure we could also all attest to, that spread so wide within an environment of toxicity and abuse is flabbergasting. It was like, all right, everyone back to business. So again, I just reiterate the complexity of and listening to athletes first. And then I would hope that the real listening comes from athletes with lived experiences. And I'm pretty tired. I don't know how you guys feel, but I'm pretty tired as like being positioned as like just an athlete in SafeSport when I've been working and living this space for over 5 years. Nobody knows what we know. So just come and ask us. Like, I think any of us, as we're sitting here, are happy to share. Like
that, the committees that get formed,
you know,
good athletes like us that have these lived experiences that have gone through it in the committees. Because I find a lot of times it's just the heads that come up. Oh, I'm going to help. Oh, you're joining now when the conversation is relevant. Oh, you want to be associated with it? Cool. But there's a whole list of us that have lived it that can actually create change because we have lived it, not just your opinions coming in. So that frustrates me a lot when I see that too.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
I felt, and in my situation, there was a lot of, what could I have done differently? And I think as athletes, there's always a lot of ownership on our performance, on, becoming successful. What could I have done to, be faster, done this gate better? How could I have done this turn better? What do I do? How hard do I work in the gym to be better? And that transitions. And I found myself there were multiple times, especially when I left, when social media comes in too nowadays for a year, I still get, you're a traitor, backstabbing bitch, fucking leave. The amount of comments that I get, and it's a lot less now that 90 plus Bobsled Canada athletes this year have come forward and said, yes, there is a toxic culture. But for 4 years, I was alone. And I don't blame the other Bobsled Canada athletes in not coming forward when I did, because they are affected. They do have to live that experience. And I had to risk it all. And I don't want athletes to have to risk it all. I ended a career and had to start a new one. And there was no guarantee it was going to work or I could actually get there or what I was walking into. But athletes are so fearful of coming forward and of speaking up. And there were times when I thought, is this my fault? Maybe I am hard to deal with. Maybe I, invited this by being good, by being successful, by being different or difficult because I want to win so badly. And the IOC actually has published a lot on, there's evidence that the higher up you go in sport, the more vulnerable you are, because you have that ability and that drive and that willingness to risk it all, everything in your life, family, friends, put it all on the line to perform. And that makes you the most vulnerable because you don't have that frame of reference and you have to trust that coach or that director or that leader to help you, and they can use that against you. So athletes are super.
Or you'll get, why didn't you just walk out of the room or walk away? And I'm not making anyone wrong when they think that. That's my number one, like my foundational moral value is if you don't know, just know you don't know, but trust that you can't just, when you're mentally coerced into something and physically, you can't just get up and walk out the door. And if you haven't lived that, like we have, people wouldn't understand it. But I love what you're saying with like, the better you get, the more you think you know, and then you're the most vulnerable person out there. It's again, just very fascinating in a way.
Yeah.
I really agree strongly with like kind of the higher you get in the sport, like the more difficult it becomes for you. And I resonate with the two of you, Allison and Kaillie, saying that, you know, you were kind of told that you were the rebellious one. Like I've been told my whole career that I was like out of control, difficult, like disobedient, all of this stuff, just because I was questioning all the time, you know, some of the practices being used. And I was honored to be team captain of my gymnastics team for 4 years leading up to the games. And it gave me such a responsibility of keeping my teammates safe. And unfortunately, like when I was an individual athlete, I don't think I had like my sense of self-respect was kind of taken away from me. I didn't really have that. But then as soon as I was team captain and now responsible for 5 other individuals, I then started to really open my eyes to, you know, wanting to make that change. And the amount of times I was threatened to lose my position as captain because of how much I was pushing and how much I was reporting, and, you know, how difficult I was, you know, was constant. And I fought so hard to keep that role. But, you know, I also questioned myself. You know, I thought maybe I am too much. Maybe I should take a step back. But I couldn't watch. For me, it was just so obvious that I had a job to protect, you know, my fellow athletes and myself. And that's kind of what kept me going. But without that role, I think I just would have faded into the background and, you know, not had the sense of purpose to keep trying to make positive changes, you know. And it's unfortunate that all of that is just ingrained in you because of, and especially, like I said, again, bringing up like the sport of children thing, is that you grow up in the culture of the sport. And so if the culture in your sport is corrupt, which I would definitely say it is in gymnastics, then, you know, how can you not embody that and become that in a way? And you're just like, if you're trying to get out of that culture and, you know, and even go as far as trying to change the culture in any way, it's so conflicting because you've lived that your whole life and you're just trying desperately to understand what's right and what's wrong, and, you know, what's good and what's bad. It's very, very confusing. And then especially if, you know, the authority in your sport is not helping direct you in the right direction, then really you're on your own. And unfortunately, it's not until, you know, much later, once I retired from the sport, that I really started to understand, you know, a lot of the things that happened that were very much unacceptable, very much abusive.
Well, I find it interesting that, and myself, although I'm still very much in sport, I'm removed from the Canadian side. The fear is gone. The fear of retaliation or retribution, the fear of speaking out or of it changing, the fear of not succeeding because I stood up to say something is removed. And you start to have real world experiences. You start to like see what it's like in offices or in buildings or in jobs where what you grew up knowing is wrong, but in sport, I'm told it's okay. So then you speak out or you try and say, hey, this isn't right. And then you get beat down on like, nope, this is normal. This is okay. This exists. That balance of like right and wrong is constantly skewed. And then you get out of it. The fear of any type of, you know, punishment is gone. And I think that's an important thing I want to chat to you guys in a sec about too, is like that fear of what's going to happen to you if you do speak up, say something, or don't put up with it, is gone. And now you can really start to see a lot of the negativity that can come in with the wrong person. And so, yeah, I fully understand that.
I just want to add one thing before I move forward, mostly because I just don't want to forget it. There was mention about like the one bad apple, and absolutely, like in a lot of circumstances, that's what it is. And there are good and bad people in every single job. But I would also like to highlight that sometimes it is just systemic, and it is completely system wide. And because it's system wide, it's even harder to make the changes because it's just so adopted and normalized that, at least if there's the one bad apple, you can target the bad apple and the future people that are like that. But if it's a system wide, like, where do you even start? And that's kind of the challenge that I feel gymnasts are facing, because it's not just one person, it's not just 10 people, it's really kind of everyone involved. The culture in gymnastics is so corrupt, unfortunately. So that's the challenge, is where do we begin?
Yeah. And I think that's what we're seeing in Canadian sport as a whole, is that it is systemic. It isn't just one bad apple, because there's reporting systems, whether it be Own the Podium, which provides funding to these national organizations, Sport Canada, the Canadian Olympic Committee. I know personally, in my case, I went to all of them. I was like, hey, I'm having a problem with my federation and my coach, not just one, but the chain of events. I said it, I can't do this to coach, to the higher ups, and they covered themselves because they hired them. And then what happens to the funding partners, which then also, well, we provided funding to this person. If this is what's happening, it's an issue. So as a whole and as a collective, this is where Canadian sport needs to change, and needs to adopt different policies and procedures, because it is systemic. And I think, that is extremely hard to break as a whole, because again, what's okay and what's right isn't always looked at with the correct lens. And so I think that's definitely an issue. I would love to get your guys' opinion on the simple question of, are we doing enough? And or in the future, what do we hope to see happens or changes? Because we all know we've gone through a system of, there's been some issues, we reported it, and we've had issues reporting and then even going through investigations. But are we doing enough now? And what do you think has to happen moving forward?
Just talking about where the power lies, like our head coach who was being abusive towards our team for the last decade, also the director for our team, and was doing all the hiring and doing all the carding, and our careers and our lives and our day-to-day was all in his hands, this one person. So everyone he hired was reporting to him, and any complaints that went to him, and they never went any further than that. And that was that he was our head coach and also the top of our program. So it was really difficult to see kind of a way forward that was safe for everybody. And then on top of that, we were also a very, very successful team for a very long time. And kind of what Allison and you, Kaillie, were referring to earlier, we were at the top of our game. And so I think to the public and to the rugby community that is actually quite small, they had no idea how we could be so successful, but be unhappy and feel unsafe. And it was like, well, you're doing well, so why are you complaining? And, oh, well, he's coaching you well, so what's the issue? And, he gives you a high five after the game, so it seems like there's a really good relationship there. And I think that was kind of the most difficult thing for us is us saying, no, like, yeah, we've been doing well because we are amazing athletes, and that doesn't change. But could you imagine who we could be as athletes and as people if we felt safe and if we felt heard, and if we came to training and it wasn't out of fear, but it was because we wanted to be there. We dream about this our entire lives. I came to the team when I was 16. I was a child, but I was kind of raised, to your point, Rosie, I was raised in this really toxic environment, and it's really hard to see a way forward. But yeah, I think we're really not doing enough. There's not enough happening. There's not enough change, and it's not happening quick enough. And I think there does need to be more athletes on these groups and these committees and these councils. But I also think there needs to be an assessment on how funding is given out. So I think that's one of the biggest things. We need all this money to train. Like I find if you don't do well, you don't get the funding, and then you continue on that cycle. And I think that's and when you're in that scarcity mindset, that's when things get really unsafe. And I think because everyone's fighting for more money and it's, you know, I don't really think it's delegated the right way in Canada. I'm not really sure about other countries, but I know for sure, you know, just the aspect of like you have to win to get funding. I think that is kind of a really dangerous place to be. But I think if we were always like, if we weren't just at the mercy of who's going to get funding for this cycle, I think conversations would look different. And I think we'd have the time to go through the hiring process and go through those background checks and make sure that the coaches and the people in our environment are there for the athletes, are there for the people, and are there to actually build you and grow you into this like really holistic person, instead of like you're there, you know, you're only there for a medal at any cost. And I think like as athletes, you know, that is kind of how we think. But I think when we start looking at ourselves as less than human and only these like athletic robots who have one thing in mind, that's when things get really scary. So I think just the way funding is delivered and the messaging behind that needs to be changed a little bit.
And there's no reporting country to country. I think that's also a big issue. And I don't know if you guys have seen this. One coach gets let go from a country and then they just switch to another. We had a coach come from America because he had multiple SafeSport claims against him. So he goes to Canada and Canada goes, well, not much we can do because the other country can't really say anything bad and there is no worldwide reporting. And so they can leave Canada, they can go to other countries, they can leave other countries and come, and we don't share in sport our experiences as much. And so these abusive coaches or cultures get to just be ignored, and transition against athletes globally are affected by this. And
yes.
So
Something I'll add, Kaillie, is to your point of what needs to happen is, I could go on forever, obviously, as I'm sure we all could, but there's like, to me, there's black and white and then there's gray. It's this new thing I'm talking a lot about. So the black and white, absolutely. Updated policies, codes of conduct with consideration of discrimination and all these things that didn't exist 15 or 20 years ago. And charity, like way faster. Like if I honestly, for 3 years, I call it like baby SafeSport Allison, pro bono Allison, sat on calls with these government experts, which is incredible, but we would spend 3 calls just talking about the terms of reference of being on the committee. So like there's a way that we can speed things up. Now the gray area, so some of the work I get into now, which is very fascinating, is I'll go right into an organization as an independent consultant and try to help them rebuild a safe sport culture. And you guys, it is fascinating. So to your point, Rosie, you know, you have to break down, like one of the biggest red flags that I see continually across the NSO landscape is who has sole discretionary subjective decision-making. Charity, you know who that was. That person you just said, they hire, they have over responsibility, they have too much power innately given to them within the organization. And then the other thing we do is we just bring in the man or woman that's had all the success in the world into a culture that doesn't exist, and then it becomes their show. So I see this all the time, whether it's a high performance director, Kaillie, or Charity, your coach, or Rosie, your system. It's like we bring someone in from another country with their cultural norms and values, and we say, help us win. So one of the biggest things that I think is a massive issue is who has too much power innately in their position, high performance directors and head coaches. And we have to break that down into objective committees and decision-making. And then the sweeping generalization, and I think it's incredible, but I think we've heard it enough, of a toxic culture. We've heard that. We are really smart people. We need to break it down into what is the normalization of behaviors that Rosie saw in gymnastics when she was 8, and actually put names to every single one of them. In my sport, it was incredibly normal for me as an 11-year-old girl to be sent on the road to ski race with a 20-year-old man and stay in hotels. That was just normal. So was that a precursor to what happened to me? Absolutely. The environment based on the normalization of the culture of ski racing at that time was completely ripe for a predator to come through. So we have to look at every single like cultural norm and rebuild those. It's a ton of work, but I think it truly can happen. Rosie, I'm sure you see that in your work with gymnastics too.
Yeah, actually, thank you, Allison, for bringing that up, because the interesting thing about gymnastics, especially rhythmic gymnastics, is that it's, the whole rhythmic gymnastics world is dominated by Eastern European countries. And that's just how it is. That's where the sport kind of came to be. And that's also where the best athletes and coaches are from. And so since I was 8 years old, which is the first time I went to train in Russia, this is the norm. And unfortunately, like us athletes, children are sent over with the coach only, like no family goes there with you. And, like I'll just speak for myself. I went to Russia when I was 8 with my coach. I stayed in the like athletes residence with the other athletes and other coaches. And we trained 8 to 10 hours a day. And at the time, like I'm going to date myself, there's no internet. There's no way of communicating back home. And then also the worst part, the most unsafe part is the customs are different there, unfortunately. Like they have their own problems. And what's considered abuse there is different as well. And so, for example, athletes were being physically harmed daily, myself included. And over there, that's not considered abuse. And then when you come back to Canada and you're now delivering good results and you're performing well, the Canadian Federation is like, well, it worked, right? Whatever it was that happened, it worked. You're doing well. You're now performing and ranking well internationally. So let's do it again, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I can't even begin to describe the customs and practices that were used on us athletes, and just like completely the Federation turns a blind eye to it. And it's kind of like, well, that happened in a different country. Things are different over there. So, what can we do?
We hire the person and then we live in their culture instead of building our culture, our organization, our expectations, and hiring the person into that. When, what I've seen, Rosie, it's fascinating. I've seen organizations do it well, and they'll tell me that they do an interview for a new coach and they drill them on SafeSport, and the coach will be like, I'm out. And I'm like, exactly. Like if that coach feels like it's too stringent or they're being told what to do and they decide to not take the job, that's what we want, right? Like we want coaches to be scared away if they're going to want to come in and just run their own show, so.
Kaillie, earlier you mentioned in the United States that there's an expectation that coaches once a year are supposed to be able to give a 1-hour presentation on a safe sport subject. Is that right?
Yep. And we have to do kind of like with the anti-doping to get, for the anti-doping stuff, you have to do that like online course that you can't just skip through and it's 1 hour on the computer and you learn about all the things. They also have that for safe sport. So what are proper policies, procedures, practices? What is abuse, harassment, discrimination? You do speak up. Where do you go to? Like they have an online. So in order to receive your funding for that year through the US Olympic Committee, you have to do a safe sport course every single year. Coaches, mechanics, and athletes.
Yeah.
So the only thing that really appeals to me about this, like specifically the presentation part of it, is that you could very passively watch all the videos and read all the, articles about this and that. And even, the online trainings, you can do that with your eyes closed, right? Like if let's just say you didn't care about it at all, you could very easily just bypass all of that and tick all the boxes. But, the idea of having to actually give a presentation means that you have to actually educate yourself. And then maybe they're evaluated on their presentation. And maybe they're told to do some more research and come back again or something like that. It's just more active, right? It's just more accountability to actually embody and learn some of the important safe sport principles that are not being delivered. So I like that. It appeals to me.
Yeah.
And you know what's crazy, Kaillie, is we have something like that here. but the mandatory online training and education that every member of every NSO must do. Okay. So here's what happened. And I say this to the NSOs with respect, because I do believe they can do better. And I work with a lot of them, but they just forgot to tell the athletes about it. Like they forgot, something got missed with the implementation of any SafeSport requirement from 2019 to 2022, where I walk into a room full of athletes and I say, who has done the SafeSport training? And they go, no one told me I had to do that. So again, if we want to look at it from the negative side, we would think the NSOs might be trying to not have them do that. But however, they also lack the tools, resources, and communication support to actually implement SafeSport practices in the way an athlete thinks. It is not okay to take the Universal Code of Conduct for Maltreatment in Sport and pick it apart and embed it into your 60-page policy suite and then embed it into your athlete agreement, right? So one of my key messages is what you're saying is SafeSport has to be taken completely out of any other documentation and educated to the level of an athlete's understanding and in a palpable way in which they receive information. I also stand in rooms of athletes every day and ask, how many of you read through your athlete agreement page by page? And again, it's like, they're like almost embarrassed if they're the person that does. So there also has to be personal responsibility on the athlete side to truly know what they're signing on for, right?
And when that athlete agreement is handed out, how many times has your agreement been handed out? And it's like, you got a day to sign this, or sign this now because we're naming the team tomorrow. And if you don't sign it, you don't get named. And so what we have recently seen in Bobsled Canada specifically, there was basically a non-disclosure clause with which the athletes have brought forth to say, we don't agree with this. Well, camp starts next week. If you don't sign it, you don't go, and we're not going to change it. And you're like, it can't be, we can't talk bad about the federation in public. And you're basically signing an NDA in your athlete agreement, or we can sue you for defamation 6 months even after you retire. And so no athlete's going to come forward. And even if you do, nothing changes, because then you don't get put on the team if you don't sign it that day. And that also, the practices and how it gets brought up to the athletes is not conducive nor protective of the athletes. So.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think like 2020, I think was like the first time anybody on my team had ever read their athlete agreement, because we were going through an investigation. And when we read through it, a lot of people were like, no, like highlighting all these things or crossing off all these things. And it was just so unbelievable, the things that were in our athlete agreement. And it was the same thing. It's like, well, if you don't sign it, you're not coming to practice, and you're not getting your Sport Canada funding. And you're just kind of stuck in this place of, I don't agree with this and I don't want to sign on to this, but I also I have a dream and I have a drive and I want to be here and I want to train. And I think like those things are just so tough. But to the point of the coaches doing like a kind of yearly review, I think those are like so important. And one thing that our team did prior to getting our interim head coach for Tokyo 2020 is we did our leadership team. So like our athletes on our team were the ones who went through and questioned all the coaches and just, gave them the rundown of everything that's been going on and how they're going to come in and try to cultivate and change the culture with the team, and not just bringing your culture to our team, but like creating something new that we all feel comfortable in. And I think that was so important to us, but because I find, especially in sport in Canada, maybe sport in general, your coach is just given to you. And the most important relationship, I think, in any sport is the coach to the athlete, or your athletes to athletes, and then it's the coach to athlete. And I find nobody really talks to the athletes about who's going to be coaching you and who's going to be spending all that time with you, and who this person really is. And so we spent a lot of time saying, hey, this is who we are, but we need to know who you are before you're going to sign on and take on 22 girls or people on this team. We need to know the kind of person who's coming into our environment. Mm-hmm. And if we can, build some sort of relationship. So I think like those reviews are so important, but also how are we choosing coaches? Who is in that room? Who is the deciding person? Who has the power? Who has the ability to say, no, we don't feel comfortable with this, or no, we need to know a little bit more. We need to know, I think there just needs to be more just clarity and openness and transparency with those processes, because we are the ones who have to come in to training every single day or 5 days out of the week or however much you train and build those relationships. So if you're just putting somebody who you think is going to drive success and ends up harming their athletes, then what was really the point?
I think too, we can all agree we are a bit of the outliers, the more outspoken ones that have come forward and that have risked it and are willing to have this conversation. But not every athlete, and I think it's important to acknowledge, feels comfortable enough to do that, nor is it their personality to come forward. And I personally, and I'm sure you guys do too, and Rosie, you talked about it, having or feeling that responsibility as a leader on the team or as somebody who does feel confident enough to bring these issues forward. But some athletes aren't. Some athletes never would be that person, would never speak up or say anything. And we have to also consider them and their safety, and not just physically in it, but that it's not okay mentally to force them to have to speak up if they don't want to. But it doesn't mean that those policies and procedures aren't there to protect the outspoken ones and then the quiet ones that aren't willing to necessarily say, but it doesn't mean they don't have an opinion or that any of us deserve to have our success put ahead of our welfare or well-being, whether it be mental, physical or whatever. And I think as an athlete, it always frustrated me so much when they would go, as Allison, you said, well, you're good, well, you're succeeding. And I'm like, that's because I work. That's something I get to benefit from, not you get to take advantage of. It doesn't mean you get to treat me less than because I'm good, or it doesn't mean you get to ignore my human right because I'm good. This is a benefit that differentiates me from other athletes, but it's one skill that makes me good. It doesn't mean you get to ignore every other human right or the environment that I'm in. That's not something they get to benefit from. It's something that, we individually as athletes get to use to create that 1% difference that makes a difference. But it's by no way does it impact our physical or mental safety at all. And I think, unfortunately, that has been the issue, is they put it all together.
Yeah, and I mean, my success was driven from anger, because I was so angry that he had done this to me and that the organization had not, I blew the whistle, and I was believed, but it was swept under the rug and all these things that, I became one of the best skiers in the world, and I was completely unhappy, unhealthy, and miserable. And I remember the first World Cup podium I got, where I should have been like, oh my gosh, this is a lifetime dream. All I was thinking was standing on the podium going, take that. Because I had proven to him, thinking he's watching at home on television, and proven to people that he didn't control my future. I think we could all attest to feeling like these people control our future. But I think, again, it's how do we, I hate that because it's like a know-how. We need to redefine what success looks like.
What do you think would be, and I'm not going to say first steps because those have already been started, but how do you think we can redefine that faster? Because we all know it has to be done faster. Making an investment now, great, but this isn't something that you can go, well, in 3 years, we'll hold people accountable or implement. No, it should be 3 months. It should be 3 weeks. What can we do to move forward faster? Because it's pretty rock bottom, the level of competency in some situations from a safe sport. So how do we elevate that a lot quicker?
Right. So I think from an athlete inclusion standpoint, again, I probably oversimplify things, but it came up for me when you were speaking, Charity, is that I'll build in athlete inclusion calendars into NSOs. So I'll do athlete consultation surveys about what style of coaching do you resonate with. This is not rocket science. This is actually asking your participants, what style of coaching do you resonate with? So what I will say is, as much as I have so much respect for the funding that is going to come through for safe sport, my key message is every single organization in Canada, because you guys, I go into clubs with thousands of kids and they do nothing for safe sport because nobody's telling them they have to. It is terrifying. And then I say to them, they say, well, we're fine because no one's ever filed a complaint. And I have to, with our services, we do independent complaint management. I say, you need to know that once you get us into your organization, you will get a lot of complaints because nobody is immune to safe sport. You're just not getting complaints because you don't have a system set up for athletes to feel safe to complain. You know where I'm going with this? Every organization needs to be taking care of themselves. They can't wait for someone else to give them the money, to sit back and be told what to do. It needs to be as important in their budgets as buying the soccer balls. Because even if they don't care, even if their beliefs are, we're fine, there is nothing as harmful to a sport as when a massive abuse case rolls in and the whole sport becomes blacklisted. So my key message at the club level is you won't have a sport, let alone a club, if you don't take care of your SafeSport challenges. But to bring it back to the athletes, you take a 365-day calendar, of which every organization should have. It's called a yearly training plan. And you build in key milestones of consulting with your athletes. Like, again, it's not rocket science, but the athletes, like, when should we deliver the athlete agreement? What should be a part of the athlete agreement? You know, I deal with organizations that don't even have athletes councils set up yet, or athlete reps. It's just not okay. So,
yeah. And from an athlete standpoint, I think it's important too, just to acknowledge that we need to be mindful of independent or like personal stories, because throughout my case and the amount of whistleblowing that occurs, well, it doesn't happen. I don't see it in the team. Yeah, well, it doesn't happen to you, but that doesn't mean you weren't the one there's targeting. There are these key words that exist to individual athletes, and whistleblowing are saying it doesn't exist in my organization. No, you just haven't seen it or you haven't experienced it. And acknowledging that every athlete has a responsibility to help their fellow teammates, or just to, if you don't have an experience, just don't talk about it. You're a lucky one, and that's great. But some people that do shouldn't be diminished, nor should you try and shut down a conversation as an athlete if you don't have that experience.
Kaillie, when just from speaking from my experience and the experience of my team, when we finally all came together, some of us have been on the team since the very beginning of like women's rugby in Canada, which was I think like 2011. And so it's been years, and we've only had one coach until Tokyo. So it was just one person, a lot of the same players, just in for almost over a decade. And we had never had a conversation like the one we had the day we decided to file our complaint investigation. But there are players who, like for instance, like our captain or our leadership group or our older vets or even our younger players and the ones who just gotten there, you know, a month or a couple of weeks previous to that conversation. And when we finally opened up the space to have that safe conversation and to say, you know, if you've felt anything, if you've experienced anything, like this is the time to say it. Like we're all here. We're looking athlete to athlete, person to person, and it was honestly so overwhelming, the stories that came out. But what was the scariest is when I thought about myself and my experience as a young athlete, as a Black female athlete in a really white dominated sport, I felt very alone in that. And when we finally opened up the space, it was every single person, to our captain to our newest, youngest player. And so I think like it's the individual stories, but often people don't feel safe to express themselves and don't feel like there's anybody else, and you feel like you're alone. And I think once you open up that space to just talk as athletes, and I think even what we're doing right now, and I know SafeSport is in the media and it's kind of everywhere right now, it's a really hot topic, but having these really like these like in-depth and very vulnerable conversations, I think are so important, because even though in the bigger picture, it's kind of all splattered over the media, having these personal conversations, I think really opens up somebody who may be experiencing something, but unsure if it's real, unsure if, you know, what they're feeling is big enough or whatever it may be. So I think this is just so important, because it's shocking, because no matter what level you are, how successful you are, how unsuccessful you are, there is something happening, and it doesn't discriminate against anyone in sport. But I also wanted to add to you about just the being successful and not being a reason to overlook all of the things that are going on. The other thing to that is, no matter if you're successful or unsuccessful, there are things happening, and I find like when you do really well, everybody kind of sees your name around and everybody knows you, and the stories take a hold of themselves and you're able to spread that information to everybody. But when you're not doing it, not a lot of people are looking your way. There's not a lot of funding coming to you. There's not a lot of acknowledgement. And I feel like your stories don't get shared the same way. So it's like, just, you know, I feel like everybody on this call is just like really successful and amazingly talented athletes and have gone to such amazing heights and have just been blessed with just such incredible abilities. But there's also those athletes who, you know, haven't reached the pinnacle of their careers yet and may never, because of how unsafe their environment is, and no one's talking about it and no one's there for them because their name is not, you know, in the big picture yet. So I think it's important to acknowledge those folks as well.
I just wanted to kind of echo, Trady, what you're saying. I always felt that I had to be the best in my sport so that I could have a voice to speak. And that's a really dangerous concept, because at what cost do you become the best only so that you can have enough of a platform within your organization to be able to even start talking about the difficulties and the abuse and the problems, right? And what you were saying, Trady, about the amount of athletes that drop off along the way, because they shouldn't have to handle any of that. They shouldn't have to tolerate it. And maybe they didn't make it to the absolute top spot in the country. And maybe because of that, they didn't have the ability to share what they were going through. And that's not how it should be. Because like you said before, I can't even begin to imagine the amount of incredible athletes we have missed out on because they have not been able to, and nor should they have ever needed to even consider tolerating the abuse that they were facing. I find it severely unfortunate. And I know many athletes personally, as all of you do, that did step down along the way before they reached the highest level that they were reaching and dreaming for, simply because it was a corrupt environment and they had more self-respect than what they were receiving from the organization. And kudos to those athletes, but also why should they have to let go of their dreams because of the problems in the system? So it's really hard when, you know, I hated that I had to work twice as hard as everyone just so that people would listen to me, you know, and that was in and of itself, that was abusive. So I really appreciate what you're saying, Trady, about, you know, the athletes that we've lost along the way. And those are the people that I feel for. And those are the people that this country will never know, which is such a shame.
It is. And the amount of mental space used to fight the system or to just be in an environment that is toxic, whether it be a coach or a culture, it definitely takes away from sport and why you're there. It takes away from fun. It takes away from your performance. And then, like you said, you can't realize your true potential, but how many more athletes could we have in Canada? How much, you know, how many more bars can be raised because the athletes aren't fighting a system? You're not constantly thinking about why I'm here, what I'm doing, and or how you're going to survive to the next day. And so when you can take all of that out of it, then, you know, how much more importance is put on performance, but that's where it should be. And hopefully then those athletes do make it through or do get to at least go through and see their full potential. And whether that is make it to the Olympics or not, they at least get to realize their potential and they don't leave sport with a sour taste in their mouth. They don't leave going, I want nothing to do with that. I'm never coaching them, or screw that. I want nothing to do with this space again because it was so negative and I didn't get to actually see my full potential. And so I think that's definitely an important piece, is that we take a lot of that mental confusion out of, you know, is this right? Is this wrong? What's happening to me? How do I survive in this environment so I can get to that next step? Because some of it is just about surviving to the next day, to the next step, until you can get out of that environment. And I think that in itself is an issue, because instead of addressing it, you're literally just surviving through performance. And I don't think that yields proper performance. And then again, we don't have the correct mind space if and when we do get to the top to be able to then just do our job. So very, very important stuff. Okay, 2 last questions before we wrap on. So I want, first question for everybody is next step. What do you feel is the next step for your sport, but then for Canadians and Canadian sport to move forward? What do you guys think needs to happen first and foremost as the next step to not only further this conversation, but to help safe sport within our country?
I'm going to go first just because it's top of mind right now. I think, there have been, since, at least for gymnastics, since, it's been in the media lately that there's some calls for an open investigation. There's been a lot of, from the larger Canadian sport organizations, there's been some kind of ideas implemented about how to change the sports system for the better in the future. But what I think needs to happen before any of that is, because I don't think Canadian sport organizations have even the remote understanding of what the problems are. So I think, before we start thinking of moving forward and putting money here and here and here in the future, and bringing up platforms for athletes to be able to report, all of that is good. But one, why do athletes first need to experience abuse before they can report in the new platform that they're bringing up? And two, do you even understand the issues in the sport? Because Allison, you were saying this earlier, every sport has a different culture. Every sport has different problems. So you can't generalize. You can't say, these are the issues in Canadian sport, because it's endless. You have to tackle each sport individually, and you have to look back on athlete experiences, give athletes a voice to talk, say what they've been through, because 100% that is what athletes are still going through today. And the athletes that are going through it today might not have the ability or the safe space to be able to report that. Whereas maybe athletes who are already removed themselves from the sport, they might be able to share the problems. So I want to encourage national sport federations and Canadian sport governments to look back into each individual Canadian sport and go back 50 years, go back a long way, and figure out what the issues have been. Open a space for athletes to be able to disclose that information safely. So if that means hiring an independent party to do that work, then that's exactly how it should be done. Because we don't understand the problems yet. How can we start tackling the problems if we don't know what they are?
I would agree with that for sure. When I think of success in sport, and the times I've been most successful, we look at the process. I look at, okay, how fast can I push this sled step by step? I jump in. How am I driving corner 1? How am I driving corner 2? I'm sure for you guys, it's literally a step-by-step process without looking at the time. How do I get the fastest time? It's how I do my actual sport, and those steps equal the result. And I agree, we're not looking at the steps or the process of how we got into this problem. We have to look back to go forward, and what are those steps for those individual sports to create success. And success in safe sport is each athlete feeling safe in their environment. And so what caused the unsafeness? And we have to look at those steps to equal the result that we want at the end, for sure.
I'll go next just because it's similar. And I think the key thing that I want everyone to understand is personal responsibility. I know that might seem vague, but whether you're an NSO or a club, I think what Rosie is highlighting and what I think the key next step is to look critically at what practices you have or don't have, policies, procedures, normalization of behaviors, the history of your culture. And in that, have the courage to step outside of what happened to you in the sport. Or I hear time and time again, well, I played hockey and I turned out just fine. So there's so much confirmation and inherent bias that's going around sport. And then I also hear, well, we're just raising soft athletes. Like I hear this all the time. It's not okay. It's 2022. Our athletes are our athletes. Our children are our children. So I just challenge everyone to take that personal responsibility to step outside of what they think they knew. And if you operate an organization, you need to look critically and understand that this is a major issue. And whether or not you've had experiences yet, they will come. So just be open to that. As an example, I would say to parents, you'll have the personal responsibility and the courage to not register your child into a sport until you feel absolutely confident that your child will be safeguarded. And asking the organizations those critical questions. What is your rule of two policy? What is your travel policy? What does it, background checks we know are not nearly enough, but at least they need to happen. So as a parent, we can't just rely on the organizations and not have the courage to say, like, I'm not putting my child in this sport with you until you prove to me that my child will be safe. So I think we all have that personal responsibility opportunity.
Yeah, I agree with the both of you. And I also think there needs to be just a level of transparency throughout the entire organization and throughout Sport Canada and just like sport in general. I think there's so many barriers and so many walls, and there's so much information that's safeguarded and kept away from just like the person sitting next to you. And I think if there was this like real level of transparency, there'd just be a lot more room for open conversations. And I find most of the time everyone's kind of searching for the answer, and it's there, it's just hidden, or it hasn't been activated. And I think if like the level of power, the level of control, just everything was just opened up, and athletes were a part of every conversation, because at the end of the day, there's nothing without us. There is no sport without the athletes. I think I think we would find the answers quicker. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree on all of it. So from there though, I'm curious, what advice would you give to, whether you have children or don't have children in sport, but what advice would you give to children, and if you don't, to your younger self throughout sport, in order to A, keep them safe, but B, to encourage them to have a great time in sport safely?
I don't have children yet. I do plan on having kids, so I'm excited about that. But anyway, that aside, right now, the really sad part about this is that myself and my partner, we have already decided that we won't be putting our kids into gymnastics. And my partner is an artistic gymnast, and I'm from rhythmic. And we have completely just closed the doors on both of those disciplines of gymnastics, just because we know that right now it's not safe. And that's a shame, because, you know, as you can imagine, most likely they will have hopefully some kind of athletic, genes in them. And it would be really nice to be able to, if they wanted to be able to kind of introduce them to the worlds that gave us so much, as much as this conversation, I know, Allison, you said it's not all negative. Like, gymnastics gave me so much, and I wish that I could give all of the positive benefits of gymnastics to my kids, but not at the risk of having them be unsafe and abused in the ways that I know are still existing. So for me, I think what needs to change for children is, I wish that I could sit here and say that, gymnastics would be a great sport for my kids to be in, because I think it's a sport that gives you so much. And unfortunately, that's not where I am. So me and my partner are going to have to choose a different sport. And I hate to say that. I really do. Because, of course, that's the first question everyone asks us. Like, are you going to put your kids in gymnastics? And people are shocked when we say no. But that's how strongly we feel about the environment needing to change.
So what advice quickly, Rosie, would you give for any parent that does have their kid in gymnastics right now, talking about the personal responsibility that Allison did, for the people that do still want their kids in gymnastics and see the benefits, or they're currently in, what questions should they be asking of their coach, of their club, of the leaders within the organization, so that they can feel a bit more confident with their kids being in it? Or what advice or what steps would you take if you did feel like you wanted your kids, knowing you have that experience, so that your kids would be safe in that same environment?
I think number one, having the kids be educated and knowledgeable about what is right, what is safe, what is unsafe, what boundaries are, like what is tough training versus abuse, right? What is in gymnastics, there's lots of stretching, what is stretching and what is overstretching that becomes physical abuse. Just teaching kids those boundaries so that they know when the boundary has been crossed. I think that is number one in trying to help keep athletes safe, is just understanding those boundaries. And then from there, creating a safe, open environment for those same athletes to be able to talk about when they feel maybe some of those boundaries have been crossed or might have been crossed.
You know, it's interesting, Rosie. I was a gymnast. It's honestly my first true love sport. And I started when I was 3, and I fortunately didn't have any abuse further than overtraining, which was quite difficult and put a huge strain on my body at such a young age. But just for the advice of parents, I think my mother did at the time the very best she could to, this was like, I don't know how many years ago. I'm not that old, not that long ago, but she was at every training session. And, at the time she was able to do that, and she was able to be there. Every time I was there, she was, always in communication with the coach. She asked all the right questions, and she sat me down probably every day and told me, what was wrong, what was right, places that I shouldn't be touched, and things that, shouldn't be said to me, or I shouldn't be in a room with this person by myself. And she made that very clear to me at a very, very, very young age. And so I always felt confident in myself, with her or without her, to know when a boundary had been crossed. And so I thought that was like something that made a huge impact in my young career. So yeah, I think as for advice to a parent, I don't have any children. I plan on having some, but at this point I do not. But I think advice for a parent, I would say to really, really talk to your child and educate them on what is right, and where their boundaries are. And it's unfortunate that it has to be that route, but I think right now, just where sport is, I don't put trust in coaches, and I don't have really trust in federations. And I think I want to put my trust in myself and in my child, to know that I've instilled you with the right tools to know when something is right or wrong. I think if I was going to give advice to myself, to my younger self, I wish that when I was in my, formative teenage adult-ish years, that I still had that same safe space that I had when I was really young, a little girl, to go to my mother and say, this doesn't feel right. Because that's, at 16, 17, 18, you don't have your parent with you all the time. You don't have them coming to all your training sessions. For me, I'm from Toronto, and I was flown out to Victoria, and I was alone with no family and no one else. And it was just me and the team. And so I think to find that person that you trust, or somehow to have that space where you can have that honest conversation with someone and say, this doesn't feel right. I feel like I'm overworked. I feel like I'm, I don't feel safe here. I don't feel looked after. I don't feel heard. I think that is really important.
So I do have 3 kids in sport, as I mentioned, and I could do a whole hour just on this topic, but that was incredibly well put, especially as people who don't yet have children. I think the critical thing for parents is, so my children, as soon as they discovered Google, I obviously knew I needed to explain to them what had happened to me. And I explained it to them in a way as I did it intuitively as a parent, even though I'm a safe sport expert. So if you do nothing more as parents listening to this, go on your Google machine and Google the stages of grooming and understand what grooming of young children is, because we cannot rely on our school system to do it. We cannot rely on our sports to do it. And then have the confidence to speak to your children and allow them that level of self-advocacy that your mom instilled in you, Charity. And without getting tearful, if you don't think it's your place to educate your own child or to advocate for them because you want to see them succeed so bad that you don't want to rock the boat of X sport, just call my parents and ask them how they felt after what happened to me happened. So as parents, we need to critically look at where are we contributing to the toxicity of the environment because we're not willing to say no because we think it'll affect our child's success. You know where I'm going with that? Like, where are we? Well, I'm just going to put up with X because it'll make my child successful. The advice I would give to myself is that it wasn't my fault. And I know maybe that sounds crazy to say at this point, but I still deal with that. And that this happened to me was horrific, but I still deal with that victim brain of who was I to allow this to happen? So just have faith and trust that any athlete at any age can understand. These kids are smart. They can understand what could be the bad things that could happen to them. And the last thing I'll say is, I said it at the top, sport is a beautiful place to raise children, in my opinion. And I say that as someone who had a horrible experience. It's beautiful. And we don't want to lose that, because I don't want to see gymnastics go away. I don't want to see bobsled go away. I just think that we need to be much smarter and be much more aware of what the challenges in sport are.
Well, and I feel I don't have kids. Rosie, like you, hope to soon, one day. My hurt side wants to say, no, they can't do bobsled. But my brain and the experiences, Allison, like you've said, that I've had within sport have been great. And the tools that I've learned, the places that I've traveled, the people that I've met have been so amazing through sport. I want my child to have that experience. And I personally feel I'm in a great place, but there is that personal responsibility as a parent that needs to happen. And the education piece, what I learned even as a 30-year-old on grooming and targeting and abuse and harassment and the definitions empowered me so much more. And I want to be able to empower my kid in that situation so that they know at their level. Yep. If they're a child, it's at a child level. If they're a bit older, here's what it is. And it's a constant reminder. And I feel I'm in a good place, having been through this, to watch for these types of things, to help look out for my kid, to question the coaches or the leaderships, to go to all the meetings and say, hey, and be the first person to put my hand up so that my kid, I'm taking control. My kid is in a safe place, and then having the courage, if I don't feel that they are, to remove them. It doesn't mean I won't put them in it. I won't try. I won't hold. I'm going to be the most pain in the ass parent in the entire world about trying to make sure people are held accountable for their actions. And I need to make sure I'm comfortable and that they're comfortable, and that dialogue does exist and is open. Like Charity, what you said, that relationship between coach and athlete is going to be different than parent and athlete, and that they do feel comfortable to talk about their experiences, good and bad, with me, and that they are educated and I'm educated as the parent in what it is moving forward, so that I keep them safe, they're kept safe, and that I feel comfortable in the sport that they're in, or the position that they're in within that sport. So yeah, I think all amazing stuff. And I just want to say thank you for you women to come forward, for you women just to talk about your stories, and most importantly, for the advocacy that needs to happen for the people that don't feel they can or have a voice, so that we do normalize these types of conversations, these words, these definitions, these stories, so that it does become not just this happened to me, but that Charity, we can have this. It's not just rugby coming together, it's Canadian sport. I've learned so much today from each of you women in your respective sports, that it's not just me. It's not just because I'm a female. It's not just mental or physical abuse, that this does happen in skiing, in gymnastics, in rugby, in bobsled, and that we can openly talk about it. And hopefully we change the culture so that there isn't the fear of retaliation or retribution. There isn't the fear for speaking up, that you won't be successful if you do. I'm proof you can be successful, even if you stand up. and that you do have the power to walk away if that's what you choose. And if you don't have that power, that's okay too. We need to help change the structure and the system for the athletes so that that doesn't have to be a choice, because it shouldn't have to be for any athlete in any scenario. And so thank you for just being advocates of sport, of safe sport, and doing everything that you guys can. I'm so empowered right now just to chat to you guys about this. So thank you very much.
Same.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm so inspired by all of you, honestly.
Oh, me too.
Yeah, thanks for speaking up.